Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Cinefile, the podcast celebrating cinema one film at a time. Each week, my co-host Jake Biller and I break down a film, discussing anything from mise-en-scène to scenes you missed. Today, we discuss what lurks in the darkness with 1931's Dracula. This is our second of our spooky Cinefile series, and this was not my pick. This was Jake's pick this week.
Yes, it was.
Now, my understanding is that this is a Halloween staple for you. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. I do watch this every year in October. Of course, me being the classics nerd, I like to watch the old monster movies, the Universal monster movies, kind of their bread and butter. Just a little quick history. I looked it up. Kind of what is called the Universal monster movies in film history. Obviously, they're made by Universal Studios. It's most film historians cite 1923's The Hunchback of Notre Dame as the first like monster movie, which I'm like, I don't know if I'd call Quasimodo a monster, but that movie like definitely treats him as a monster in a way. And then usually the people regard the cutoff in 1960 with The Leech Woman. But it's during this time you have films like The Silent Phantom of the Opera. I believe that's 1925 with it's the first, I believe it's the first film adaptation of The Phantom with Lon Chaney, the man of a thousand faces, playing the Phantom. And he's notable in that for his look, the makeup on that movie. But you also have things like 1931's Dracula, but also Frankenstein, The Bride of Frankenstein, all kind of in that wheelhouse. The Wolfman. Trying to think what else. Ooh, there's something. Oh crap! I can't think of the title. There's something about a Black Lagoon. It's like the creature from the Black Lagoon, or
I think you're right. I think it's Creature from the Black Lagoon. Yeah,
that's in there. That comes a little later. I think that's like 54. Plus or minus a couple years. But anyway, so this is like when you think of like the beginning of horror movies, this is very much in that vein. It's in that tradition. And this is a movie that feels very much like it was made in 1931. And I've always known that, but it really stuck out on this rewatch for me. And I'm just going to lead it off by saying I didn't enjoy it as much as in years past. There were, I don't know if it's because after watching it every year, I mean, don't get me wrong, there are still things I enjoyed about it. But I don't know if the luster's worn off watching it year after year. But yeah, I'm interested to hear your take on it because you hadn't seen this before, had you?
No, I'd seen Nosferatu,
Yes.
which they actually name drop Nosferatu in this film. And basically a quick TLDR on Nosferatu is that that director wanted to make a Dracula film, but couldn't get the rights to Dracula. So he made Dracula Light. And that's roughly what Nosferatu translates to, is Dracula Light. Which seems
Coming
like
to
maybe an oxymoron. Yeah. So
you've heard of Oktoberfest beer? We give you Dracula Light.
Dracula Light. And if you come to Flicks in the month of October, we do have Oktoberfest as our beer on tap. Anyway, yeah, so I'd seen Nosferatu. Nosferatu is a silent film. And so this obviously, actually, I think the only Dracula movies I've ever seen are in black and white. So it wasn't really jarring that way. But it was definitely of the time period.
Mm-hmm.
So this movie came out, as we mentioned in the open, in 1931. That is in the Great Depression era, aka an era where film didn't really happen much, but I mean it did, but it was on the cheap. Because people like weren't gonna spend money to go to the theater when they couldn't put food on the table.
Yeah.
And my understanding, and Jake kind of told me this, is that this movie was supposed to be a bigger production. But then when the Depression hit and Jimmy Stewart gave out the last of his dollars in It's a Wonderful Life,
Mama Dollar and Papa Dollar went out the window.
That this kind of shrunk down. One of the things that I kind of want to start it off with is the lack of score.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We open on an I couldn't tell you, Jake. You probably know.
I do know it's from it's the
Tchaikovsky.
It's a Tchaikovsky piece. Yes, it's from his ballet Swan Lake. It's probably one of the most recognizable pieces of ballet music and just of classical music. You've probably heard it before. For those of you who watched Dracula or are going to watch it, you'll probably recognize it. But yes, that's it's from a piece of music that already existed, right? And
right.
so there wasn't any score, and I found that really interesting. Reading up on it, and this kind of makes sense, having seen like some of his films that are would be considered contemporaries. Is that filmmakers kind of thought that people wouldn't like score or wouldn't understand score because if they didn't see music being played, or if it wasn't diegetic music, that they would wonder where the music is coming from, and that would pull them out of the movie, which is an interesting attitude given that in 1931 we are really kind of freshly off the transition from silence to talkies, to
right.
talking movies. And so you go back to silent, where there was music wall to wall pretty much, because you didn't have sound effects or dialogue, so you needed something under the picture to kind of give some emotional cues. And so I find it really interesting that we go from literally all music to no music. Like I'm not sure how the thought process played out there, but
yes. What I'm actually doing right now is looking up Moscow. And I'll explain. Yeah, so the Moscow Film School is the proprietor, if I remember correctly, of the Kuleshov effect.
Okay.
But this came about during, actually, it was 1919. So that would have been, what, around World War One?
Yes, that's I think, putting my history knowledge to the test, I believe 1919 is the last year of World War One.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking I could be wrong about this, but it's obviously the Moscow Film School, and what I'm trying to get at here is that especially during periods where film stock was short, where they didn't have a lot, they had to get really creative. And so when I saw that they didn't have a score, it almost reminded me a little bit of that, because which, and it's so interesting because this film is shot like a stage play.
Mm-hmm. It's actually,
in a lot of ways.
It's not to cut you off here, but it's based on a stage play. That's how Bela Lugosi gets the role of Dracula, is he originated the role on stage. This is pretty faithful to a stage play adapted from Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. And to your point you made earlier about how this was supposed to be made for much more money and much bigger production, the original idea was to make it faithful to the book Dracula. But the stage play that this ended up being based on is a very pared down version of that book. So this, in a way, is an adaptation of a stage play that's an adaptation of a book. So I find it really interesting that you could feel that it was a stage, or came from a stage play.
Yes, and I definitely could. Yeah, I could feel that, and so that's why I think it's interesting they didn't have a score, because a lot of musicals have like non-diegetic music at points. Mm-hmm. So, but obviously at this time, when this came out, 1931, that isn't necessarily musicals. Vaudeville is still kind of big, so that's a whole thing. And to correct myself from earlier, so I was thinking not Moscow, the Soviet Film School, which came about in the early 1900s. And that was about trying to, during World War One, they were shooting film, but they were experimenting with putting bits and pieces together to see if they could string a narrative along. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Kuleshov effect, which is one of my favorite film techniques. When we talk about Bela Lugosi's Dracula, the way in which he looks. But yeah, it all kind of seemed of the time period in that way. It kind of seemed like they were trying to make a mountain out of a molehill in a way. Just in the way in which it looked, in the way in which they approached it. The thing that really stuck out to me, talking about the Kuleshov effect, is the way in which they cut. They do these kind of intercuts with like a close up of Dracula's face. But as I told you, it's the same shot.
Yeah.
Like they use it multiple times. And so that's what I mean when I say that it seemed like it was done for cheap. You could tell, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is noticeable. And so you could tell that they used that technique of just adding this like this intercut shot of his face. They use the same one over and over and over again. And it like honestly doesn't really take you necessarily out of the film. But that was one clear way to me that it said, okay, this was shot during the Depression.
Yeah. Yeah, Universal did not have a ton of money, and so they had planned this for like I said, a big production, being faithful to the Dracula novel by Bram Stoker. But when Wall Street crashed and the Depression hit, and they weren't making money off of films because, like you said, if you can't afford to keep the lights on or put food on the table, you're not going to go to the movies. So they were really just trying to stay afloat. A lot of the studios were at the time. So you run into a lot of movies that are made for cheap. And I will also say, like I also pointed out earlier, like we're relatively new to talking movies with sound. So sure. I think there you still see some of the growing pains with making that transition. And it's really interesting, getting into the effects of making it for cheap. Everything I read is basically everyone except Bela Lugosi like just threw in the towel when they found out like their budget was getting cut so much. Like even Todd Browning, the director, was basically like wholly uninterested in this because they didn't give the budget he wanted, which I understand. If you have this grand idea for what you want the movie to be, and then they say, we liked that. How about half the budget?
Right.
That's got to be frustrating.
Yeah.
And the actors too, they were very kind of took a very apathetic view towards it, and I think you notice that in the performances in this movie. I'm not going to say like they understand their characters, they just don't care enough to like give a good performance, I think, besides Bela Lugosi. And I know you have some thoughts on that, but as far as like among the cast, like they kind of took it as a joke that Bela was taking this so seriously. There's stories that he would walk around as they're setting up the shot before they're getting ready to shoot. He would be walking around like behind camera in his full costume, like in his makeup trailer, looking at himself in the mirror and saying, I am Dracula. Like just repeating that line over and over, like would mutter it to himself on set, I am Dracula. And everyone was basically kind of like, why are you taking this so seriously, dude? But he was, in a way, it was his process because he was so committed to this role. And in a way, like reading that, it reminded me is like, oh, like he was method before method acting was a thing.
Right. Yeah. And okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that kind of the behind the scenes part of that. Yeah, I thought the performances in this left a little bit to be desired. Yeah. One of the things when I was watching this that I really thought of is this is a great companion piece to the book. The book I haven't actually read. But you can tell that the audience probably needed some holes to have already been filled in.
Mm-hmm.
And that also with the performances being the where they are, kind of cringe, um, in a lot of ways. Like your interest had to have already been there
Yeah.
to be able to be held, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Like I will say Renfield is just wild. Like that's I said he's Gollum with clothes. Like he literally he's so unhinged.
Yeah.
And so it is a little interesting that you say they didn't take this super serious because like you look at characters like Renfield or like Van Helsing, uh and say like I wonder if what we would have had if they would have taken this like seriously.
Yeah.
Because it was a little cartoonish. I think all the different characters were a little larger than life.
Mm-hmm.
And Bela Lugosi's character looked weird because he wasn't as much. Um, it was just like a really weird dynamic. So it's interesting that you had that kind of backstage. Everyone was like, "Oh, we really don't care about this. Like, we're not really getting a paycheck anyway,
Yeah.
and nobody's going to go see this." But yet it has
Mm-hmm.
endured for nearly a century.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's when we watched it, I mean, it's included with Amazon Prime. So like obviously like someone is watching this for them to include it on a streaming service. So to me, like I find it just interesting that it has endured so and it's become part of the horror genre and really kind of, going back to like the origins of the horror genre. Like even thinking I was watching this kind of I was thinking back to Halloween, the movie we talked about last week, and I just found it interesting to think like we don't have a Halloween without Dracula, and is like strange as that seems because these are two very very different films. Like just understanding the progression of like people went and saw this and the other monster, Universal monster movies, and Universal said, "Hey, we can make money making horror movies." And if they hadn't, if that hadn't been the realization, I don't think they would have stuck with horror as a genre. You know, they wouldn't have stuck with it, and then we don't get something like a Halloween. We don't get something like The Exorcist, or I mean, what we're on like the 10th Saw movie now.
Yeah, Saw X, or as I
Yeah,
like to call it, Sawks.
socks. Yeah,
I literally because I've been lead in a couple of those theaters,
yeah.
so I'll tell my guests I'm like, "Welcome to Saux." Um, but it what also is really interesting is looking at this from a modern perspective,
Mm-hmm.
um, where franchises are king,
Mm-hmm.
where IP is king. Uh, it's really interesting to watch this because I looked up and Bela Lugosi never reprises his role as Dracula except for one time in an Abbott and Costello movie in
Yeah,
the 50s. And watching it with modern eyes, I'm like, this is ripe for this Universal monster movie universe should be a universe. And ironically, in 2017, they announced what was going to be called the Dark Universe, starting off with The Mummy with Tom Cruise. And that was going to start this Universal monster Dark Universe. And it never got off the ground because that movie was poorly received. But I'm watching this and I'm like, Van Helsing, Dracula, like this could all be because I thought it was a little bit more interconnected than it was. And while I think characters would show up, it wasn't necessarily always the same actor, which I thought was really, really interesting. Um, so I could see while I was watching this, putting my business hat on, if you will, where oh, Van Helsing could pop up in here and here and here, and Dracula could pop up here and here, and it just never happened. They didn't capitalize on that,
yeah.
and I just thought obviously you could tell this was made in the 30s as well because franchises like that weren't huge. Obviously, they used a lot of literary properties
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of these older films, but you just expect today to see, an end tag that says like Dracula will return.
Yeah.
And he doesn't. And so as a modern audience, I'm like, okay, if the actors don't care and he doesn't reprise his role basically ever again, what's the point in watching this? And like you said, I mean, this was the precursor to so many modern horror films.
Mm-hmm.
And this movie isn't scary.
Yeah.
It's not scary. And I wonder if in 1931 people thought it was scary, but it's not a scary movie. But it just has the atmosphere, the mood, that it kind of encapsulates for an hour and 15 minutes is the same kind of atmosphere that would go on to create something like a Halloween, that would go on to create something like an Exorcist or one of the Saw movies, or even, I don't know, Scary Movie's a spoof, but they even riff on it. Night or Elm Street, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yeah.
All the movies that we've never watched because we don't like horror movies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And I think it's really interesting talking about it from the business side and seeing, like, as a modern audience being like, this is ripe for franchise. And it was. It really, really was. But that was not.
That wasn't the focus.
No. And if you look at how the business side of movies, or how studios approached movies in a business sense back then, movies didn't have the same lasting, call it legacy, lasting footprint, shall we say, that they do today, right?
Right.
Very
much so.
This bookshelf of movies behind me, like, there was no DVD, there was no VHS, there was no physical way for you to be like, oh, I went and saw that movie, I liked it, I want to have it myself. You didn't watch movies at home. I mean, we didn't have TVs, and like,
right, you play it in the field.
Yeah, exactly.
Every house had a field.
You went out and got dirty. Exactly. All those things that our grandparents yell at us. You need to get outside more.
Yeah. Back in my day, we played stickball. We played stickball and hoop 'em.
Yeah.
And yeah. That game where they have like a big hoop and they tap it with a stick?
Yeah.
Like, what the heck?
What is that? Someone explain to me the goal of that game. Like, it fascinates
to walk
me.
Away.
to waste an hour not thinking about how we don't have any food.
Right. I was like, George Lucas looked at that and was like, oh, that's General Grievous's speeder.
Exactly.
That's literally anytime I see like a spinning hoop like that, I'm like, General Grievous. Which is another topic for another day.
Yes. But getting back to the point
on track. Yeah.
Back to the point I'm trying to make is, when they made this, no one ever thought that someone would watch this again. They thought, that's like,
fried. That is fried.
Like, film and movies were so disposable back then. Like, there was no thought of preservation. I mean, I've read accounts of films that we consider lost nowadays from, this time in the late 20s and early 30s, of there are films that we consider lost because there's no original negative print or no existing print period in any form.
There's like a significant amount of film from that period that we will never see. Right.
And I've read interesting articles where they find global warming has led to finding some lost films, because if you look at like how distribution chains for films happened, they would usually start on the East Coast, and like that same reel of film keep getting shipped west, and the last point in the United States was Alaska.
Right.
And so they would be done with these movies and they would just like chuck them outside in like makeshift landfills, and like would get frozen over. And now, because of global warming, if there is a positive to climate change and global warming, is somehow these negatives have been preserved, and they've found reels of films they thought were lost in melting icebergs.
Ladies and gentlemen,
is just wild.
We did it. Yeah, because, and then there's this idea of film decays.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's not properly preserved, then it's going to like decay and you won't be able to see it again. I guess I believe there's like a vinegar smell that'll come out.
Yeah.
Like if you open up a can like a film, if it's kind of not good, you'll smell a little vinegar in it. I mean, look at it this way: the moon landing. We don't have an original print of the moon landing.
Yeah.
It was shot over.
Probably. Yeah.
They literally shot over the original moon landing.
Yeah.
So we only have the footage of a moon landing, from my understanding, is that it was played on a TV and then they put a camera up to the TV and then recorded it, which is clowning.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you can kind of tell that film wasn't treated with as much respect as it is today. One of the main things that you'll notice when you watch this movie is the audio.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like a fan's blowing the entire time. And that's something that I texted you, because nowadays with modern technology and AI, we have an ability to go in there and probably remove some, maybe all of that static. That honestly, if you were to do that today, you do take something called room tone, and then you'd be able to like fix it that way. But you'd be able to remove some of it, and they chose not to when they kind of remastered this. But that for me, but it worked in like a weird way. It provided this kind of uneasy atmosphere because we're watching something, and we're just hearing that static the whole time. But ironically, at the time, I don't think that was a director's choice. That was a producer's choice. I think it's just because they didn't preserve film the way they should.
Yeah. No, you're right. And you're right. It does have this kind of welcome quality to it that feels like it fits. And I think it's because there's, like we talked about earlier, there's no score, and there's not like there you don't hear like very purposeful sound design, I think, in a lot of like the non-dialogue portions of this movie. So to remove that static, it would literally be a silent movie. You would just be sitting there watching Dracula walk, or like watching this carriage like ride, and
watching a bat drive a carriage. I never thought I'd ever see a bat drive a carriage.
Yeah.
Like, I know the actors didn't care, and you're right. It's clear the director didn't care, because he's like, we're going to show a shot of a bat that we clearly have hanging on a string because it only makes one movement. And we have it clearly hanging on a string, and then we're going to hang it so it looks like it's direct, like it's driving the chariot.
Yeah.
But yeah, so honestly, and this is just a thought, could it be that because we have the static, that this movie actually endures and is brought up more than other films in that time period, because it isn't just silent and then audio, like a talking dialogue, and then back to silence? Could it be
that? Perhaps. And I think, just overall, I think it just plays into this very nostalgic feel of that, some people really, I really enjoy. I mean, yes, it is kind of a lull to watch sometimes, but I think there's just this really neat quality of watching things that have, watching the origins of film in a way. And I think it's just kind of wrap up this kind of idea we're talking about how they had such a different approach to film. I think it's so cool that we can sit here and discuss this movie that the producer, the director, the actors thought no one would ever see again after it went out of theaters. I think that's just fascinating. And just to sit here and talk about the choices that were made and think about it through that lens, but then apply a modern take to it, I think is just fascinating. And it gives you, I think, an appreciation for how far film has come, and inspires you to think forward to what could be next.
Right. And that's, film preservation is something that I wouldn't say I'm necessarily like passionate's not the right word, but I find it very fascinating because that Lost Gospels, right? I think there are at least 3 books mentioned in the Bible in other books. 3 different texts are mentioned that we don't have. Like I think Paul wrote another letter to the Corinthians. And then there are like the annals of the kings of Israel. I think that's in like Samuel, 1st, 2nd Samuel. Anyway, like these lost media things I find very, very fascinating because it could change the way we look at old Hollywood or the way we look at the Bible or ancient Israel or whatever you want to. Those were just examples I made up. I didn't make them up. They came to my head. But it for me is this constant question of like, what are we going to find next? And how is that going to change? And so looking at this film, because it has been preserved, we can see, like we mentioned before, the trajectory of how it is influenced. But what if there was another movie, another Dracula movie with him in it? Like, it's just all these what ifs and scenarios I find really, really fascinating. And film preservation is definitely more popular today. I know, like you said, Jake, you've got all of your goodies right there. You got all of your DVDs. And I have my Blu-ray and 4K discs, which, look, I know all the people at Disney and Lucasfilm watch this. So I'm speaking directly to you. Okay. There's a movie called Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. It came out this summer. At the end of August, it was released on digital media. It was released to purchase. You still have not announced a physical release date. What I need you to understand is that my collection is not complete until I have that 5th disc. And I'm going to look at that thing, and there's going to be a spot that it should be there, and it's not. And
what's the deal, man?
What's the deal?
Bob Iger, what's the deal?
Yeah. So because you're watching, I need you to know, I need it. Make 1 copy. Make you know what? Make 2. Make 1 and give it to the National Archive, and then give the second one to me. Make sure it's 4K. Copy? And then make a DVD version for Jake, because Jake watches DVDs and doesn't think that, I get Blu-rays and 4K discs because they're almost future-proof in that, like, if we had an 8K screen, you can't really tell a difference between 4K and 8K unless you're really, really close, right? So, for those of you at Lucasfilm, release the physical media of Indiana Jones: The Dial of Destiny. Or I will dial up your destiny. End of rant.
I really enjoyed that rant. I didn't know I needed that in my life, but that really entertained me.
Thank you, because you just don't understand. Okay. I haven't been on a date in 3 years.
What does that have to do with anything?
I don't get out much. I don't have things to look forward to other than work and Jesus. So I need this. I need it. Anyway.
What are we talking about? I don't even know anymore.
Dracula. We're talking about Dracula.
Yes.
I kind of want you to keep this into the podcast.
Oh, it's staying in. It's staying in.
It's like we're almost out of time until our second. Speaking of reels, we do 2 reels here. Our second reel, we're almost out of time, and we got 1:49 left. And
what else do you want to stump about?
Yeah. What else do you want to talk about? The last thing I wanted to talk about was a little bit about confusion with animals. It's a new segment. Because obviously they were confused. One of the first scenes at Dracula's humble abode, which, bro, get a cleaning lady. Like, you're not a spider, so you don't need to have cobwebs everywhere. Also,
They-
yeah, you need to sleep on Transylvania dirt. The rest of your room doesn't need to be the basement. I live in the basement. Anyway, um, so we see armadillos
Mhm.
freaking roll out.
Yes, we do.
And so I immediately went to Google and said, are there armadillos in Germany? Because obviously, or Hungary, because Transylvania and Hungary are like, Transylvania is not real, but Hungary is like a close proximity. So it's like, are armadillos native to Hungary? And after a thorough search, the answer is no.
Yeah.
So bro had to fly those boys in, which was hard because there were no planes. So he had to boat them in from.
Well, he could
Uh,
fly.
Imagine an armadillo, like a bat picks up an armadillo, and the armadillo's like,
Flies all the way to the New World.
then yeah,
They're native to
Texas.
the southwestern US, and I'm pretty sure parts of Central America too. And
I don't know.
maybe,
I saw some in Florida, not Florida, South Carolina.
okay.
I saw armadillos once.
I think
I was like, I know. Are you an aardvark? They're like, no, he's an
no.
armadillo. It's like, crap. So you're not Arthur. Anyway, so you apparently have some information
Yes,
on
because
this.
I'm the animal nerd. I did have to look this up though. So apparently, it was thought that, or in history, it was thought that, I don't know if this comes from like Native American culture or like Aztec Mayan, because like I said, I think they're native through like Central and pretty sure South America too. So I don't know exactly the origins of this, but because you see armadillos burrow into the ground, I guess people observed armadillos like burrowing in like a cemetery or a burial ground or whatever. And so the thought was that armadillos feast on dead flesh. So that's
Well,
why
that
they
yeah, that's
included,
automatically the first thing I think of.
yeah. I mean, that's what they thought.
Time for dinner.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I mean, they might feast on dead flesh. They eat insects. So, like, if you're decaying and there's, I don't know,
yeah. They
worms.
feast on top of dead flesh. They don't
Yes.
feast dead flesh. Yeah.
But, and so the common thought was, and like I said, I don't know culturally where this misconception comes from, but they were observed burrowing in a burial ground. And so people said, well, they eat dead flesh then. And so that was the idea of including the armadillos here, which is a very specific detail for a movie that doesn't care about the details at all.
Yeah. I like this. The other thing, and I want to mention werewolves in just a moment, but speaking of not caring about the details, I did want to also mention the edit because this movie should have been an hour long. Like you literally could
Easily.
have cut like 15 minutes of just dead space. Like when they would cut from or like Dracula is like the slowest vampire of all time. Bro
My
literally
God, yes.
moves so slow. And I'm like, dude, just bite her already. But when they do that cut to adjust his face, there's just literally, yeah, I see. Yeah.
That's how Dracula moves.
Yeah. Oh, I've got you over here. And all I just saw was you moving closer and closer to the screen. I was like, I know that. But look at that rack focus.
Ugh,
Dang.
look at those
Shout out
pores.
iPhone.
God. Ugh,
Um,
didn't need to see my skin up close like that.
and anyway, so yeah, so there's like dead air.
Yeah.
And that honestly took me out of the film as well. And I kind of had an issue with that. But the last thing I wanted to mention before we move on to Rosebud and Thorn, vampires and werewolves. Sometimes they're bats, sometimes they're wolves. Make up your mind.
Yeah.
Make up your mind. That's why we're having misconceptions of creature hour, or whatever I called it earlier. That
Yeah.
if you're a vampire, you're a vampire. If you're a werewolf, you're a werewolf. You can't be both.
Yeah.
You can't be a werefire.
It's definitely weird, the association that they have. Honestly, is this what inspired Twilight? The conflict between
Honestly, man.
vampires and werewolves. Because like even like it's there's the most obvious time is when Dracula disappears out the window and someone says, "Look, it looks like a big dog running." And we're supposed to, I think, infer that Dracula turned into a werewolf or
Well,
at
and
least
then
a
Van
wolf.
Helsing says sometimes
Yeah,
they turn it. Yeah.
yeah, he mentions that. But then probably my favorite line in the movie is when Renfield shows up to Dracula's castle at the beginning, and they're slowly, of course, walking up the steps, and the wolves start howling. And Dracula stops and says, "Listen to them, children of the night. What music they make." Which I love that line. It's I think it was voted at one point like top 100 lines in all of cinema by the American Film Institute. They take top 100 votes all the time, so I don't know what iteration.
That is true. That is true.
But so like there's obvious even from that, like there's a connection that Dracula has to the wolves, and seeing him, or not seeing him, but being told that he turned into a werewolf by Van Helsing, or that's possible, makes sense. But I found that an odd connection because there's monster movies that I've seen where it's like they're opposing each other, like in Twilight, they're at odds with each other.
Right.
And they're very much separate entities. We think of, at least what I think of when I think of monsters, I think of them as very separate things. So yeah, I don't know if it's just the evolution of creature movies or all these monsters, if they've just we've divided them. I don't know,
Yeah.
because that's going back to our lengthy conversation about how old this movie is. I don't know how a 1931 audience reacts to that. I don't know if if they're like us and thought, wait, I thought these were two separate things, or if maybe that was normal to them, and we're the ones that are like, well, it's been separated, so we think of them as separate.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, maybe at the time period that was more normal, but we're in a post Twilight era. So
yeah. Team Jacob.
I literally turned it off.
Because that's my name. I've never seen it, but
I couldn't get through it. I was on a date and I said, I have to turn this off. We can't finish this. This is
and
terrible.
Then Ben didn't get a second date.
It's been 3 years. Anyway, now now on to Rosebud and Thorn. We've had a lot of fun today,
yes.
But we're going to move on to Rosebud and Thorn.
Okay.
Jake, I know it was your pick this week. I'm going to pass it off to you. What are your Rosebud and Thorn for Dracula?
All right, I do have some roses. He's the only one that takes it seriously, but I like Bela Lugosi, and it's probably the reason that I still come back to this movie, is I enjoy his first iteration of Dracula, really, on the big, or one of the first on the big screen. I mean, it's really his performance that every other Dracula that came after it is built on, and really our understanding of vampires is built on. You really, I would say, like, don't see a lot of influences from, I would say, Nosferatu. I would have a harder time, I think, tying that to like a modern concept of Dracula, or tying those through.
Yeah, I agree.
Through further iterations. Whereas when you think of Dracula or just vampires in general, you think of the Transylvania accent, and you think of the long flowing capes and the slicked back hair, and just the very angular facial features. And so I think it's so iconic, and I think there's a reason for that, and it's because he's the only one in this movie that took it seriously, and I think there's just an endearing quality to that. I'm also going to say I kind of liked Van Helsing. I feel like
I did too.
He was a clown and like very much a caricature, and like I couldn't understand him half the time because he had such a thick accent and talks like this. It was just,
that's why I'm a subtitle advocate.
Yes. But I felt like there was a seriousness about that character too. And so and he and Dracula are very much adversaries. because he's the only one that really understands what Dracula is. And so like they're like mental, shall we say, or like because like they don't like fight each other really. There's no physical aspect to it, but they're
Right.
very
It's like a
they're
mental match.
yeah,
Like it's like a chess match.
a
Yeah.
battle of wits, if you will. And so, but I appreciated that performance. That's Edward Edward Von Sloan is the actor's name. So I'm going to give a rose to him, and then also the set design. Yes, I know you harped on it's so dirty, but like that's what it's supposed to be. That's the film, and I think the set pieces of Dracula's castle and oh shoot, I can't think of the abbey that he buys, but the abbey he buys in London or rents or
Carfax.
whatever. Carfax, thank you.
Because I was like,
Show me the Carfax.
yeah, I was like, where's the fox, dude?
Exactly.
Where's the Carfax fox?
But I thought
that was the wolf. It was the Carfax.
Yes, it all makes sense now.
Yeah, there we go. We solved it.
But I felt like that they're very like classic Hollywood. Like you can tell these were built on sound stages, but just there was like a nostalgia there that I really enjoyed, and I think it was fitting for the mood of this movie. And just I think it allowed. While the cinematography is not great in this, I think it built in some neat wide shots. I'm thinking when they chase Dracula and Mina, yeah,
Mina.
They chase him through the abbey and they go up the stairs. I was taken by that shot, and I really noticed it there. So I'm going to give it a rose to set design. Bud, like I just said, the cinematography is not great. Visually, I think this movie kind of struggles to keep you interested, and it seems you can tell that they didn't care in the way it's shot and the way it's edited.
Right.
I agree with your point that this could be cut down to an hour movie and it would be a lot better. Obviously, older movies tend to have a slower pace. That's just audience taste at the time. We're used to a faster pace, especially for a horror movie. So I felt really could feel this movie drag. So that's going to be a bud for me. And then my thorn is going to be just like pace overall, because I felt like the story progressed very, very slowly. And the editing kind of slowed it down. So I'm going to give a thorn to the pace and no score. I feel like if this, honestly, can someone just write a score and add it into the movie?
I feel like I was thinking about that. That would be a prime vehicle to start a practice.
Yeah. I would be really interested to see that, and I think that would add. I think it would almost make the movie feel faster, or it would almost give the movie like the deliberate pace some purpose. If I'm hearing something that's giving me emotional cues as to what I'm seeing, but when it's just Dracula slowly walking, I don't feel tension build off of that. I don't feel the emotional reaction. And that's what this genre is supposed to be about, is about emotional, visceral reactions. Like we talked about last week with Halloween. It's about reactions, whether that's a jump scare, whether that's forebodingness or brewing evil. That's where this genre succeeds. And so the fact that it didn't have that score, I felt was a big detriment to this movie.
Yeah. Any thorns?
No, the pace and the score. No, those are my thorns.
Oh, I thought those were still buds. Okay.
No, thorns.
Okay, good, because they are thorny.
Oh boy.
Yeah, no, I did like this movie. I really did. Bela Lugosi gets a rose from me for a performance that's semi-believable. I genuinely there's a shot in this. I'm gonna give a rose to a certain shot.
I love it. I love it.
It's at the beginning when Dracula like wakes up for the first time and he's standing, and there's this dolly shot that it like dollies in on his face, and it's kind of slow and a little menacing. And I mean, that's chef's kiss. Yeah. That is such a good shot. It is so good. So I'm gonna give a rose specifically to that, because the cinematography in this movie is not great.
Yeah.
But that chef's kiss. I also I'm gonna give a rose to the character that played Martin. That dude is such a clown. He says the most out of pocket stuff. Like he said, he goes, come here, you old fly eater.
He had no chill.
He had absolutely no chill. And that was like really funny. The buds, I think we could have done a little bit more with story. It kind of felt like we just kind of went through the motions, and I didn't really feel like there was some narrative pace issues. I think I just really didn't feel invested. No. And I think that's why I said this is like a good companion piece to the book, because it like realizes the characters on the big screen, but it doesn't really add to anything in my opinion. And then the lack of score is going to be a thorn. I really think that it needed that, and the cinematography, I really didn't like that. But yeah, so those are my rosebud and thorn. We're during the Spooky Cinefile series, or last week at least, we didn't do Who We Think We Are. I've got a pick this week.
Do you have a pick? I do have a pick as well.
Okay, all right. We'll start off with you as always. Okay. I wonder if it's the same guy.
I love that you gave a rose to Martin, because I knew you would love his sense of humor. It is very much your sense of humor. It's savage and kind of roasty. And it was so, yeah, I knew you would like that. So I mean, I wrote down one line, and I looked. Tanner watched part of this with me, my roommate, and I looked at him, and I was like, I need to write down that line. It's when he says, he's talking to like, I want to say she's like a maid or like some woman that works.
Yeah.
And he says, they're all crazy except you and me. And I'm not so sure about you.
Yeah, I know. That was so great.
He said that, and I was just like, that's Ben. Like that comedic timing, because like he's like, they're all crazy except you and me, and then takes like a little bit of a beat and like just like kind of looks her up and down. It's like, well, I'm not so sure about you.
he's a dude savage. Is a legend. Yeah, I also I was like thinking about maybe picking Martin for you too, because like I don't know, I just think you'd find him funny too.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna go with Dracula. I'm gonna go with Bela Lugosi, and the reason why is because it's like classic Hollywood, and you love classic Hollywood. Yeah. And he's very much regal, and I think even in his performance is appreciative of classic cinema. It's really a nod to that. So because you're such a nerd, I was like, okay, gotta give it to Dracula. But no, Martin's low-key somebody's spirit animal. Like, yeah. Like he literally just does not care. He called him a fly eater. Like that, the fact that Renfield was just like thirsty for flies was
master. His eyes also, like after he
Gollum with clothes, bro. Gollum honestly, with clothes.
Honestly.
Yeah. He's got one fly to rule them all. Anyway. Now we're gonna move on to some final thoughts. Jake, as always, I'm passing it off to you. What are your final thoughts?
Final thoughts. Like I said at the beginning, I didn't like this as much as I have previously on rewatches, but I still like it, and I appreciate where it comes from, and appreciating and understanding kind of the origins, right? The origins of the horror genre and monster movies, and then kind of seeing where that's grown today. Because obviously there's been many iterations of Dracula as a character, and also as just vampires in general. So just kind of seeing the origins of that, I really enjoyed. If you're a student of film history, like we are, I would say give it a watch. You may not like it. You're gonna struggle through some parts, but I think it's important to appreciate if you're one that wants to understand how film has evolved. But yeah, that's kind of my final thoughts.
Yeah. For me, this is not a movie for everyone. Mm-hmm. It's clearly made in 1931. It's clearly slow paced. There are definitely some editing issues. The fact that it doesn't have a score, it really is not going to be for everyone. But when you think about what we've talked about, how it is important in the landscape of horror filmmaking, it's a clear representation of how they did film during the pandemic. Not the pandemic.
Honestly, though, that would be I feel like that would be an interesting like academic subject to explore, like comparing and contrasting depression filmmaking and pandemic filmmaking.
Right. So they didn't change budgets on pandemic filmmaking. They just didn't make any money. So it's clear that there are those influences. So I think from an academic standpoint, you will enjoy looking at it, saying, okay, how are the outside factors of the depression, not the pandemic, the depression, the actors not caring, how that all kind of falls into place. So like I said, this isn't for everyone, but if you kind of like classic film, if you are a student of history, I think this movie's for you. But the real question is, what do you folks think? Have you seen Dracula 1931? Did you even know there was a Dracula from 1931? Let us know. Your review, your comments. We love hearing from you down below. If you like this video, hit that like button and ring that bell with the subscribe button, making sure to turn on all notifications for upcoming videos. Next week, we're doing 2018's The Invisible Man, kind of going more into the classic horror movie genre, which with another interpretation of Invisible Man. Make sure to follow us on social media. Follow Jake, myself, Cinefile. You've got all the links right there. And for Jake Biller, I'm Ben Sparrow. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you back here next week. And cut.